Julie Johnson's life ended on a bitter January evening in Warren, Michigan. The chilling sound of a single gunshot shattered the quiet suburban street, leaving the neighborhood in a stunned silence. Moments later, Jim Ladner's frantic voice on the 911 line pleaded for help, claiming he had just found Julie bleeding outside their home. Her body lay on the frozen pavement, lifeless, as neighbors gathered cautiously, their breath visible in the icy air. Emergency responders arrived, but it was too late. Julie was gone. Jim, shaken and visibly distressed, told officers he had seen a hooded figure running into the shadows moments before he discovered her. The story seemed plausible, and the initial impression pointed to a botched robbery or random violence. However, Warren's law enforcement community knew better than to take appearances at face value. Julie's death was a shockwave. At 34, she was a bright light to those who knew her, a dedicated professional, a caring mother, and a beloved friend. People spoke of her warmth, her ability to uplift those around her, and her commitment to providing a stable life for her young son. Her sudden violent death left a void, one that demanded answers. Detectives began their work that night, scrutinizing every detail of the crime scene. There was no immediate evidence of forced entry into Julie's home, no stolen items, no signs of a struggle. The circumstances left them with more questions than answers. Jim's account of a fleeing suspect raised eyebrows. It fit too neatly into the narrative of an innocent boyfriend caught in a tragic scenario. His distress was evident, yet his history with law enforcement, a string of prior arrests for theft and assault, added complexity. As the forensics team combed the scene, the detectives focused on Jim. His inconsistencies in recounting events, coupled with his checkered past, painted him as an early suspect. Still, one lead does not a case make. Hours turned into days, and the investigation remained murky. The hooded figure from Jim's story remained elusive, like a ghost haunting a case that refused to yield its secrets. Julie's family, grieving and desperate for answers, provided a glimpse into her world, her dreams, her struggles, and her relationship with Jim. Yet it was a casual mention of another figure in Julie's life, Marcy Griffin, that shifted the investigation's direction. Marcy, Jim's ex-girlfriend and the mother of his children, had a complicated history with the couple. What seemed, at first, to be a mere footnote in the story would soon come to dominate it. Julie Johnson's murder grew more complicated with every turn of the investigation. Detectives had initially focused on Jim Ladner, her boyfriend. His criminal history and the convenient sighting of a hooded figure made him a compelling suspect. But as they delved deeper, the puzzle shifted. Jim's alibi checked out. He had been at a nearby gas station minutes before the shooting. Surveillance footage supported his account. Though his criminal past raised eyebrows, it didn't connect him to the crime. The mysterious, hooded figure, a cornerstone of Jim's story, led nowhere. Frustration simmered in the department. Then came Marcy Griffin. Her name first surfaced in conversations with Julie's friends and family. As Julie's relationship with Jim blossomed, Marcy had made no secret of her disdain for her ex's new life. Julie had confided to friends that Marcy seemed to harbor an unsettling animosity. "She'd show up at Julie's workplace," one co-worker recalled, "always with some excuse, but it was obvious she was keeping tabs on her." Another neighbor reported seeing Marcy parked outside Julie's house at odd hours, watching from her car but never approaching. Detectives began to piece together a disturbing portrait of a woman consumed by envy. 2 years of fixation, 2 years of bitterness, 2 years of Julie living under the shadow of Marcy's hatred. What had begun as petty resentment had festered into something darker. Old text messages retrieved from Jim's phone painted a chilling picture. Marcy had sent scathing messages about Julie, calling her names, belittling her, and blaming her for the end of her own relationship with Jim. "This woman thinks she can replace me?" one message read. "She doesn't belong in his life or his kids' lives. I'll make sure she's out of the picture." Detectives now had their first tangible lead. Marcy Griffin wasn't just angry, she was obsessed. Her behavior had escalated far beyond the realm of jealousy. Surveillance footage from local businesses near Julie's house on the night of the murder revealed more. A familiar car parked on the corner, just out of direct sight. It was registered to Marcy Griffin. She claimed to have been home all evening, but her vehicle's presence told a different story. The case against her began to mount, yet Marcy wasn't acting alone. As detectives sifted through phone records, they uncovered an alarming series of calls and texts between Marcy and two men: George Ryder, her current boyfriend, and Eric Gibson, a friend of George's with a long history of trouble with the law. Marcy's venomous words about Julie became a disturbing backdrop to an emerging conspiracy. Detectives knew they were chasing something more sinister than a lover's quarrel. They were unraveling a plan that hinted at calculated malice. The tide had shifted. No longer a case of random violence or a lover's impulsive act. This murder was beginning to look like a meticulously orchestrated act of vengeance. Marcy Griffin's motives were clear, but the involvement of George Ryder and Eric Gibson hinted at a darker complexity. What began as petty jealousy had spiraled into a lethal vendetta, and the lives of three people intertwined in a deadly plot. As the investigation shifted toward Marcy Griffin, the full depth of her fixation on Julie Johnson came to light. What the detectives uncovered was more than a history of bitter texts or a passing disdain for her ex's new girlfriend. It was a pattern of obsessive behavior that bordered on pathological. Marcy had always been protective of her relationship with Jim Ladner, even after it ended. She viewed Julie not just as a rival, but as a usurper, a woman who had stolen her place in the family she once shared with Jim. Friends and acquaintances described her as someone who couldn't let go of the past, frequently bringing up Jim in conversations and fixating on his new life. "She was always talking about Julie," a co-worker recalled. "She'd say things like, 'She's ruining everything,' or 'If I can't have Jim, she shouldn't either.' At first, I thought it was just frustration, but looking back, it was so much more than that." The texts found on Marcy's phone grew darker with time. One chilling exchange between her and George Ryder revealed a plot that seemed to stretch back months. "I can't stand it anymore," she had written to him. "She has to go. It's the only way." George's replies were equally damning. He had offered his support, but there was another name in their messages: Eric Gibson. George described him as someone who could handle things. Detectives began unraveling a conspiracy. Eric, a petty criminal with a string of arrests, had been brought into the fold by George. Surveillance footage and phone records showed a chain of communication linking Marcy to George and George to Eric. But it was Marcy's own actions that truly laid bare the extent of her obsession. A search of her home revealed a notebook filled with Julie's name, photos, and even details of her daily routines. Julie had been under Marcy's watch for years. The entries were a mix of rage and desperation, with scrawled phrases like, "She'll never take my place," and "Jim was mine first." The most damning evidence came from Julie's closest friends, who shared their concerns in the weeks leading up to her murder. Julie had confided in them about Marcy's unrelenting presence in her life. "She told me Marcy had been following her," one friend said. "Julie was scared but didn't think it would go this far. She thought Marcy was just bitter, not dangerous." Marcy, for her part, maintained her innocence. During questioning, she admitted to harboring ill feelings toward Julie, but denied any involvement in her death. Her demeanor, however, betrayed her. Detectives noticed her defensiveness, the nervous tapping of her fingers on the table, and her inability to keep her story straight. Then came the tipping point. DNA evidence. A pair of gloves found in the car parked near Julie's home matched Eric Gibson's DNA. Additionally, residue from gunpowder was detected on a jacket belonging to George Ryder. With each new piece of evidence, the circle around Marcy tightened. The trio's communication in the hours before the murder painted a grim picture. Marcy had coordinated the plan, George had acted as the intermediary, and Eric had pulled the trigger. It was a conspiracy born of jealousy and resentment, executed with chilling precision. Julie's life had become a casualty of Marcy's obsession, her happiness a threat to a woman who refused to move on. As the detectives prepared their case, the focus shifted to tying the suspects' roles together in a way that would hold up in court. The courtroom was packed, every seat taken, as the trial of Marcy Griffin, George Ryder, and Eric Gibson began. The air was heavy with anticipation, a mix of grief from Julie Johnson's family and a morbid curiosity from the public. The prosecution was resolute, armed with a mountain of evidence meticulously pieced together by the detectives. At the heart of the case was a narrative as chilling as it was compelling. Marcy, driven by years of envy and rage, had orchestrated Julie's murder. George, her loyal partner, had acted as the go-between, enlisting Eric to carry out the violent act. Each played their role in a conspiracy fueled by jealousy, a toxic cocktail that left an innocent woman dead. The prosecution wasted no time painting Marcy as the mastermind. They presented text messages in which she described Julie in venomous terms, calling her a homewrecker and swearing to end her influence in Jim's life. Witnesses testified to Marcy's erratic behavior in the years leading up to the murder. Her stalking of Julie, the threatening phone calls, and the obsessive surveillance. But it was the physical evidence that truly sealed the narrative. Forensic experts linked Eric to the murder weapon through DNA, while gunshot residue on George's clothing connected him to the crime scene. Marcy's phone records tied her to both men in the hours leading up to and following Julie's death. The defense struggled to counter the mountain of evidence. They tried to argue that Marcy's words were empty threats, that George and Eric acted independently, and that the prosecution's theory relied too heavily on circumstantial evidence. Yet every argument crumbled under the weight of the prosecution's meticulous presentation. One particularly damning moment came when the jury was shown footage from a gas station near Julie's home on the night of the murder. George's car, with Eric as a passenger, was clearly visible, circling the block minutes before the shooting. Combined with the gloves and the gunpowder residue, it became impossible for the defense to argue coincidence. Marcy's own testimony proved disastrous. In a calculated move, her attorney placed her on the stand, hoping to humanize her and shift the jury's perception. Instead, she came across as cold and unrepentant. When pressed about her relationship with Julie, Marcy's voice trembled with thinly veiled anger. "She had no business being in my life," Marcy said. "She was trying to take everything that mattered to me." The prosecutor seized the moment. So, you saw Julie Johnson as a threat? Marcy hesitated, her carefully rehearsed demeanor cracking. I didn't kill her! She finally spat. No, the prosecutor replied, her voice sharp. But you made sure someone else did, didn't you? The courtroom fell silent. Marcy's refusal to answer spoke louder than any words. The trial dragged on for weeks, with each piece of evidence painting a clearer picture of the crime. George and Eric, desperate to avoid the harshest penalties, turned on each other in their testimonies, each blaming the other for the ultimate act. However, both implicated Marcy as the driving force behind the murder. She told us what to do, George admitted under cross-examination. She said Julie had to be gone for good. Eric's testimony echoed the sentiment, though his demeanor was far less composed. It wasn't my idea, he muttered. I didn't even know the woman. By the time closing arguments were made, the jury's decision seemed inevitable. The prosecution had woven a tapestry of motive, opportunity, and evidence, leaving no doubt about the trio's guilt. The verdict was unanimous. Marcy Griffin was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. George Ryder and Eric Gibson were found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy, their roles as accomplices sealing their fates. For Julie's family, the convictions brought a measure of closure, but the loss was immeasurable. No sentence could return Julie to her loved ones or erase the scars left by Marcy's jealousy. The courtroom verdict brought justice, but no relief for Julie Johnson's family. Her mother, Carolyn, wept quietly as the words guilty rang through the chamber. While Marcy Griffin, George Ryder, and Eric Gibson faced life sentences, Carolyn and Julie's young son faced a lifetime of loss. In the days following the trial, Carolyn spoke to reporters, clutching a framed photo of Julie. No sentence can bring her back, she said, her voice trembling. But justice means her killers won't hurt anyone else.